The rise of the British Empire, from the 16th to 18th century. The early beginnings. England in the 16th century. In the early 16th century, England was a relatively small island nation with limited global influence. Its population of around 3 million was overshadowed by larger European powers like Spain and France. However, this modest kingdom was poised to begin a journey that would eventually establish the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Tudor dynasty ruled England during this transformative period. Henry VIII, who reigned from 1509 to 1547, initiated major changes, particularly in religion. His break from the Catholic Church and the creation of the Church of England had far-reaching implications. This religious upheaval not only reshaped domestic politics, but also set the stage for future imperial ambitions. Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, ascended the throne in 1558. Her 45-year reign, known as the Elizabethan era, was marked by growing national confidence and stability. England began to look beyond its shores, driven by economic opportunities and religious rivalry. The Protestant Reformation had created tensions with Catholic powers like Spain and Portugal, making expansion not just a commercial venture, but also a religious and political mission. Under Elizabeth, England developed its naval capabilities. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation allowed English mariners to undertake longer voyages. Key figures like Sir Francis Drake, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who sponsored the first English colony in North America, were central to this early maritime expansion. The age of exploration, voyages, and discoveries. By the dawn of the 17th century, England's global ambitions accelerated. Joint stock companies financed expeditions to find new trade routes and valuable resources such as gold, spices, and timber. Religious motivations also played a role, with England seeking to spread Protestantism and challenge Catholic dominance. Explorers like John Cabot, an Italian sailing for England, made early contributions to North American exploration. Henry Hudson searched for the Northwest Passage and explored what would become vital English territories. The Caribbean emerged as an early focus. Permanent settlements like St. Kitts, 1624, and Barbados, 1627, became economic powerhouses due to their sugar plantations, fueling further expansion and contributing to the development of the transatlantic slave trade. The 1620 voyage of the Mayflower brought the Pilgrims to Plymouth, establishing a lasting English presence in New England. Colonies like Jamestown and Plymouth laid the groundwork for England's growing American empire, establishing the first colonies, North America and the Caribbean. The 17th century saw rapid colonial expansion. The 1630s marked a wave of Puritan migration to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, forming the backbone of New England's early settlements. This movement, known as the Great Migration, significantly strengthened England's hold in North America. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, disrupted ties between England and its colonies, allowing for increased colonial autonomy. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, King Charles II renewed interest in overseas possessions, leading to greater investment and administrative reforms. In 1664, England captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch, renaming it New York and gaining a vital port. The 1670s saw the creation of the Carolina colonies, where rice and indigo plantations drove economic development. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 exposed tensions between settlers and colonial leaders, prompting a shift toward greater reliance on enslaved African labor. The Salem witch trials of 1692 reflected deep social and religious unrest within the colonies. By the century's end, the British government began consolidating control through institutions like the Board of Trade and Plantations, laying the foundation for a more structured colonial empire. The rise of the East India Company. The East India Company, founded in 1600, would become one of the most powerful forces in British imperial history. Originally intended to facilitate trade with the East Indies, it soon focused on India. Its first trading post was established in Surat in 1615, after securing trading rights from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Over the decades, posts in Madras, 1640, Bombay, 1661, and Calcutta, 1690, were established, forming the backbone of British power in India. By the late 1600s, the company's ambitions expanded beyond trade. The Anglo-Mughal War, 1686 to 1690, marked its first foray into political and military conflict. Although the war was not a complete success, it signaled a new phase in the company's role. As the company grew, concerns in Britain led to increased parliamentary oversight through the Regulating Act of 1773 and the India Act of 1784. These measures laid the groundwork for direct British rule, which would become the British Raj. The British in the Atlantic slave trade. Britain's rise as an imperial power was closely tied to the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in its history. Starting in the early 17th century, English merchants established trading posts on the African coast to facilitate the capture and sale of enslaved Africans. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672 by Charles II, institutionalized the slave trade. The triangular trade became the foundation of British colonial wealth. European goods were traded for slaves in Africa, who were then transported across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, to work on plantations in the Americas. The raw goods produced, sugar, tobacco, cotton, were shipped back to Europe. Ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London flourished, their economies deeply intertwined with the exploitation of enslaved people. The Middle Passage was notorious for its cruelty. Overcrowded ships, disease, and inhumane conditions led to high mortality rates. By the late 18th century, the abolitionist movement began to gain strength. Figures like William Wilberforce spearheaded efforts to end the trade. These efforts culminated in the abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which banned the transatlantic trade. While the trade was outlawed, slavery itself persisted until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which came into effect in 1834 and freed hundreds of thousands of enslaved people across the British Empire. The act marked a significant moral and political shift, though the legacies of slavery continued to shape the empire's history. The early beginnings. England in the 16th century. In the 16th century, England was a relatively small and insular island nation with limited global influence. With a population of around 3 million, it was overshadowed by larger European powers such as Spain and France. Yet, this modest kingdom was on the cusp of a transformation that would eventually see it become the largest empire the world had ever known. The Tudor dynasty presided over England during this pivotal era. Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547, initiated profound religious changes. His break with the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England had far-reaching consequences, both domestically and abroad. This religious upheaval not only redefined English identity, but also laid the groundwork for its imperial ambitions. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, ascended to the throne in 1558. Her 45-year reign, known as the Elizabethan era, ushered in a period of relative stability and growing national confidence. Under Elizabeth, England began to look beyond its shores, driven by a mix of economic ambition and religious rivalry. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Europe, and Protestant England found itself in opposition to Catholic powers like Spain and Portugal, both of which had already established vast overseas empires. Two notable figures of this maritime expansion were Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh. Drake, a skilled navigator and privateer, became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, 1577 to 1580, enriching England through state-sanctioned raids on Spanish ships. Raleigh, meanwhile, spearheaded early colonization efforts, including the ill-fated Roanoke colony in 1585. Though unsuccessful, these early ventures set the stage for future English settlements. The Age of Exploration, Voyages and Discoveries. The dawn of the 17th century marked a turning point. England's aspirations expanded rapidly, motivated by wealth, strategic power, and religious zeal. The country began to position itself as a serious maritime power. Joint stock companies like the East India Company financed long-distance voyages and helped launch England's colonial presence in Asia. English explorers had multiple aims: to find new trade routes, to access valuable resources like spices, gold, and timber, and to spread Protestantism as a counter to Catholic imperial dominance. Though Italian by birth, John Cabot sailed for England in the late 15th century and laid the groundwork for England's territorial claims in North America. Later, explorers such as Henry Hudson searched for the Northwest Passage and explored large parts of North America's eastern coastline. Hudson's name remains attached to major geographic landmarks, underscoring the long-term impact of his voyages. The Caribbean soon became a focal point. England's first permanent settlement in the region was St. Kitts, 1624, followed by Barbados, 1627. These islands became central to the empire's economy, largely due to the booming sugar trade, an industry that played a pivotal role in the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. Another milestone came in 1620 with the voyage of the Mayflower. It brought the Pilgrims to New England, where they founded the Plymouth colony. Along with Jamestown, Plymouth became a foundation stone of England's expanding American empire. But England was not alone in these pursuits. Competition with other European powers, especially Spain and the Netherlands, led to frequent conflicts over territory and trade. As English settlers expanded, they encountered diverse indigenous communities, forming alliances or clashing violently. These encounters had profound consequences, including the tragic spread of European diseases. This period also saw the emergence of transatlantic trade networks. The so-called triangular trade linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a complex economic system. European goods were traded for enslaved Africans, who were transported to the Americas. The products of their forced labor, sugar, tobacco, and cotton, were then shipped back to Europe, establishing the first colonies, North America and the Caribbean. By the mid-17th century, England had firmly committed to its colonial project. In North America, the 1630s witnessed the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a haven for Puritans escaping religious persecution. This movement, known as the Great Migration, greatly increased the English presence in New England. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, disrupted support from the mother country, leaving many colonies to govern themselves with increased autonomy. However, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 renewed royal interest in colonial affairs. Under King Charles II, England expanded its reach, capturing New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664 and renaming it New York, a strategic gain that bolstered trade and settlement. During the 1670s, the Carolina colonies were established, with South Carolina developing into a major producer of rice and indigo. These cash crops shaped the region's economy and deepened its dependence on enslaved labor. Colonial unrest grew, as seen in Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, in Virginia. This uprising exposed tensions between frontier settlers and colonial elites, prompting shifts in governance and an increased reliance on enslaved Africans for labor. The rise of the East India Company. The East India Company, founded in 1600, began as a trading enterprise seeking access to the lucrative markets of Asia. However, over time, it evolved into one of the most powerful institutions in the British Empire. The company's first trading post was established in Surat, India, in 1612. By 1615, it had secured trade rights from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Over the next several decades, the company expanded its footprint, setting up key bases in Madras, 1640, Bombay, 1661, and Calcutta, 1690. These trading posts eventually became major cities and centers of British influence. Though its early focus was commerce, the company's ambitions grew. The Anglo-Mughal War, 1686 to 1690, while not fully successful, marked the beginning of the company's transformation into a political and military power. This shift culminated in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Led by Robert Clive, the company defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies, marking the start of British political dominance in India. The 1765 Treaty of Allahabad gave the company the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, making it a de facto governing power. Concerns in Britain over the company's vast power led to parliamentary interventions, such as the Regulating Act of 1773 and the India Act of 1784. These laws increased government oversight and laid the foundation for the eventual establishment of the British Raj in the 19th century. By the late 1700s, the East India Company controlled large territories, maintained its own army, and administered millions of subjects, becoming an empire within an empire. The British in the Atlantic slave trade. One of the darkest aspects of British imperial history is its role in the Atlantic slave trade. Beginning in the early 17th century, English merchants established trading posts along the West African coast to facilitate the capture and sale of enslaved people. In 1672, the Royal African Company was granted a monopoly over the English slave trade, turning this brutal practice into a state-sanctioned enterprise. The triangular trade system saw European goods exchanged for enslaved Africans, who were then shipped across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, the infamous Middle Passage, to labor on plantations in the Americas. The goods produced by their forced labor, especially sugar and tobacco, were shipped back to Europe, enriching British ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London. The human cost was staggering. Overcrowded slave ships led to high mortality rates, and those who survived the journey faced lives of relentless exploitation. The 18th century expansion, wars, and acquisitions. The 18th century marked a transformative era in the expansion of the British Empire. Moving beyond its early colonial ventures, Britain entered a period of strategic wars and territorial acquisitions that would reshape its global presence and elevate it to the status of a dominant world power. The century opened with the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, a conflict fought over who would control the Spanish throne. It ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, which yielded substantial gains for Britain. The acquisition of Gibraltar, a small but strategically vital peninsula at the entrance to the Mediterranean, gave Britain a critical naval stronghold. In North America, parts of Canada were ceded to Britain, expanding its territorial reach. Perhaps most controversially, the treaty also granted Britain the asiento, the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. This agreement further entrenched Britain in the transatlantic slave trade, marking a dark and profitable chapter in imperial history. But it was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, that truly catapulted Britain into global dominance. Sometimes called the First World War, due to its scale, this conflict pitted Britain against France and its allies across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, 1763, a defining moment in world history. Britain emerged as the leading colonial power. France ceded Canada and much of its North American holdings. Spain surrendered Florida, further consolidating British control across the continent. In India, British influence expanded dramatically, setting the stage for eventual dominance over the subcontinent. A critical turning point occurred during this period in India. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, forces of the British East India Company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This victory marked the beginning of British political rule in India. What had begun as a trading company evolved into a powerful governing entity. Control over Bengal, India's wealthiest province, gave Britain vast resources and revenue, fueling further expansion. Despite these successes, Britain's imperial ambitions suffered a major setback in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The loss of the 13 colonies dealt a blow to British prestige and global influence. However, in an ironic twist, this defeat shifted Britain's focus toward Asia and Africa, regions that would become the foundation of the next phase of imperial expansion. Even as the American colonies slipped away, Britain continued acquiring new territories in the late 18th century. In India, the East India Company, emboldened by previous victories, fought a series of wars against regional powers, including the Anglo-Mysore Wars and the Anglo-Maratha Wars. These conflicts steadily expanded British territory and influence, laying the groundwork for total dominance over the Indian subcontinent. The American Revolution, loss and adaptation. The American Revolution marked a watershed moment for the British Empire. What began as a dispute over taxation and representation in 1775 evolved into a full-scale war for independence. The 13 colonies along the North American eastern seaboard, once considered the crown jewel of the empire, were lost, forcing Britain to fundamentally reevaluate its imperial strategy. For nearly 2 centuries, the American colonies had provided Britain with raw materials and a lucrative market for manufactured goods. But following the 7 Years' War, Britain attempted to tighten its grip and recover war debts by imposing new taxes. The colonists, who had developed a strong sense of identity and autonomy, pushed back. Tensions escalated into armed conflict. The war proved long, costly, and demoralizing for Britain. Despite early victories, British forces were soon entangled in a multi-front struggle, not just against the American revolutionaries, but also their European allies, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The war strained British military and financial resources and revealed deep flaws in imperial governance. The final blow came in 1781, with the surrender at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally recognized American independence, stripping Britain of territories that had defined its imperial identity for generations. Beyond the immediate loss of land, the defeat triggered a crisis of confidence. The British public and political leadership questioned the viability of holding distant colonies and feared that similar rebellions might erupt elsewhere. In the aftermath, Britain began to shift its approach. The American Revolution highlighted the limitations of indirect rule and the dangers of allowing colonies to develop strong local identities. In response, Britain turned toward more centralized and direct colonial governance, a strategy that would be implemented most notably in India. The loss also spurred reforms in colonial administration and led to a strengthening of Britain's military and naval power in other parts of the empire. Determined to avoid future insurrections, Britain doubled down on controlling its remaining territories and looked to expand into new regions. India, already a key focus, became even more central to British ambitions. The East India Company ramped up its military campaigns and forged strategic alliances to extend British influence. Through a combination of force and diplomacy, the company's power expanded rapidly, laying the foundation for the British Raj and eventual direct crown rule. At the same time, Britain introduced reforms aimed at tightening its grip over other colonies. The goal was to prevent the development of the kind of autonomous colonial identity that had spurred the American Rebellion. The Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath. At the dawn of the 19th century, the British Empire faced a formidable new challenge: Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged from 1803 to 1815, would put Britain's military, economy, and diplomacy to the ultimate test. These conflicts not only reshaped the map of Europe, but also cemented Britain's status as the world's leading naval and colonial superpower. Britain stood at the heart of a global struggle, facing off against Napoleon's ambitious French Empire. The war spanned continents, from Europe to the Americas, from Egypt to India, and were fought both on land and at sea. Britain's role in this immense conflict was pivotal. Through its naval supremacy, vast financial resources, and a network of alliances, Britain helped to hold back Napoleon's expansionist ambitions. One of the most decisive moments came at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, the British fleet achieved a crushing victory over the combined navies of France and Spain. This battle not only destroyed any hope Napoleon had of invading Britain, but also secured British dominance of the seas. Nelson's immortal signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," became a national rallying cry. Though the wars were enormously costly, they also spurred innovation and industrial growth. The demands of sustained conflict accelerated advancements in manufacturing, iron production, and shipbuilding, laying the groundwork for Britain's continued industrial leadership in the years that followed. In the aftermath, Britain emerged from the conflict as the undisputed world power. At the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, European leaders gathered to redraw the continent's political boundaries and establish a new balance of power. Britain played a central role in shaping the post-war order, promoting a system designed to prevent any single nation, like Napoleonic France, from rising to unchecked dominance again. This foreign policy approach, often referred to as splendid isolation, would guide British diplomacy through much of the 19th century. Britain's territorial acquisitions during the wars were significant. In 1806, it seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch, an essential strategic outpost along the sea route to India. Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, was also added to the empire, strengthening Britain's grip on the Indian Ocean. These gains expanded Britain's global footprint and opened new routes for trade, migration, and settlement. The end of the Napoleonic Wars ushered in a period known as Pax Britannica, or British peace. With no rival able to challenge its naval power, Britain turned its focus to consolidating its empire and expanding its economic influence. Overseas trade boomed. British capital flowed into colonies and emerging markets, and British political and cultural institutions spread far beyond the homeland. The scramble for Africa, colonization, and conflict. As the 19th century drew to a close, Britain's imperial focus turned increasingly towards Africa. The scramble for Africa marked a dramatic new phase of colonial expansion, one that redrew the continent's borders and set the stage for decades of European domination. At the center of this expansion was the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Attended by representatives of 14 European nations, the conference sought to formalize territorial claims and avoid conflict among colonial powers. But it gave little thought to Africa's existing kingdoms, societies, or ethnic boundaries. For Britain and others, Africa had become a chessboard of imperial ambition. Britain's motivations were complex but clear. First, control of key trade routes, especially the Suez Canal, the gateway to India, was essential. Second, Africa's natural resources promised vast profits: gold and diamonds in South Africa, rubber in West Africa, and cash crops across the continent. The British envisioned a Cape to Cairo corridor, a continuous line of colonies stretching from North to South Africa, connected by railways, telegraph lines, and rivers. Though never fully realized, this vision drove British policy for decades. In North Africa, Britain established control over Egypt in 1882, claiming it was to protect financial interests in the Suez Canal. Soon after, it launched a military campaign in Sudan, culminating in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, securing its influence in the region. British rule in Africa varied by region. In West Africa, especially Nigeria, Britain practiced indirect rule, governing through local leaders under British supervision. This allowed traditional structures to remain in place, but under colonial control. In contrast, regions like Kenya and southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, experienced direct rule, with significant British settler populations and tighter colonial authority. The impact of colonization on African societies was profound and often devastating. Traditional political systems were disrupted. Local economies were reshaped to serve British interests. Cultural practices were suppressed, and new borders, drawn with little regard for ethnic realities, sowed the seeds of future conflict. Resource extraction became the centerpiece of British rule. Forced labor was used to build infrastructure, harvest cash crops, and mine precious minerals. These riches flowed to Britain, fueling its industrial growth, while impoverishing countless African communities. African resistance to colonization was widespread, but often met with brutal force. While not under British rule, uprisings like the Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907, and the Herero and Nama genocide, 1904 to 1908, in German-held territories highlighted the violent repression typical of colonial regimes. The British Raj, India under British rule. The year 1858 marked a major turning point in the British Empire's relationship with India. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown assumed direct control of India, ending the rule of the British East India Company and ushering in the period known as the British Raj. Under this new system, a viceroy was appointed to govern India in the name of the British monarch. A centralized colonial administration was established, designed to consolidate British power and oversee a vast, diverse subcontinent. The Raj brought sweeping changes to India's economy and governance. British policies focused on extracting raw materials, cotton, tea, opium, to feed Britain's industrial growth, while also turning India into a market for British manufactured goods. To facilitate this, the British invested heavily in infrastructure. By 1900, India had the fourth largest railway network in the world, designed to link ports, cities, and resource-rich regions. Though built to serve military and commercial interests, the railways also fostered internal mobility and communication, inadvertently helping to unify nationalist sentiment. By the late 19th century, this educated Indian middle class began to organize. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded initially to push for greater rights and participation within the colonial system. Over time, it evolved into the main vehicle for India's struggle for freedom. World War I marked another turning point. Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for the British Empire, many believing that their sacrifice would be rewarded with political reform. But Britain's post-war promises fell short, leading to growing frustration and unrest. The role of missionaries and religion. As the British Empire expanded across the globe, it wasn't only soldiers and administrators who made the journey. Accompanying them were missionaries, driven by religious conviction and a desire to spread Christianity to the farthest corners of the world. They saw their mission as twofold: to convert non-Christian peoples and to bring what they believed were the benefits of Western civilization. Missionaries often arrived before colonial officials, venturing into remote areas to establish a foothold. They set up schools, hospitals, and churches, institutions that not only provided education and healthcare, but also served as powerful tools for Christian evangelism. Their influence on indigenous societies was profound and controversial. Many communities experienced widespread conversion, which often led to the disruption of traditional beliefs and social structures. Yet the process was rarely smooth or uniform. In many regions, resistance to Christian teachings remained strong. Some communities maintained their traditional religions, while others developed syncretic faiths that blended Christian beliefs with local spiritual traditions. Missionaries frequently worked in close partnership with colonial authorities, viewing their work as complementary to British governance. Through education and moral instruction, they fostered loyalty to the Crown and helped create a class of English-speaking, Western-educated elites who often served as intermediaries between colonizers and the local population. The World Wars, the Empire under strain. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at the height of its global power, ruling over vast territories across every continent. But the decades that followed would bring a series of devastating challenges. The two world wars not only redefined global politics, they accelerated the decline of the British Empire. World War I, a global war, an imperial burden. When World War I erupted in 1914, Britain quickly turned to its empire for support. Soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean were mobilized to fight alongside British troops. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers served during the war, with hundreds of thousands more coming from across the empire. These men endured brutal conditions, often fighting in foreign lands far from home. World War II, the final blow. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Britain again turned to its empire. This time, even more soldiers were called up, over 2.5 million from India alone, along with hundreds of thousands from Africa and the Caribbean. Colonial lands became vital military and logistical hubs. But as soldiers fought for freedom and democracy, many began to question why those same rights were denied to them in their own countries. Their experience of war and exposure to new ideas and global movements intensified demands for independence. In 1941, Britain and the United States issued the Atlantic Charter, pledging the right of all peoples to choose their own government. Though intended primarily for countries under Nazi occupation, colonial subjects seized upon it as a moral promise of future freedom. The Commonwealth of Nations, the empire's legacy. As the British Empire gradually faded into history, a new organization emerged to preserve the bonds forged during centuries of colonial rule, the Commonwealth of Nations. Rather than simply replicating imperial power, the Commonwealth evolved into a voluntary association of independent nations, united by shared history and common values. This transformation began with the Balfour Declaration of 1926, which recognized the autonomy of British dominions such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, acknowledging them as equal in status to Britain. This principle was legally formalized with the Statute of Westminster in 1931, granting these countries full legislative independence. In the aftermath of World War II, as waves of decolonization swept through Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, many newly independent nations chose to join the Commonwealth. Their participation shifted the organization from a group of predominantly white-majority former dominions into a diverse global network. Today, the Commonwealth comprises 56 member states across Africa, Asia, the Americas, Europe, and the Pacific. While most have historical ties to the British Empire, not all were former colonies. What unites the Commonwealth is not political control or economic alignment, but a set of shared values. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law form the foundation of the organization, as outlined in landmark declarations such as the Singapore Declaration of 1971. These principles support cooperation and dialogue among nations with otherwise vastly different systems and cultures. In response, the Commonwealth has worked to adapt and modernize. In the 21st century, it has placed greater focus on global issues such as climate change, sustainable development, education, and gender equality. The organization strives to use its diverse membership and shared values to encourage collaboration on these critical challenges. Ultimately, the Commonwealth reflects both the positive and negative legacies of the British Empire. On one hand, it provides a framework for peaceful cooperation, development, and dialogue. On the other, it remains a reminder of a complex colonial past that continues to shape international relationships. Looking ahead, the Commonwealth's future depends on its ability to stay relevant in a rapidly evolving world. It must balance the diverse interests of its member states, remain responsive to global change, and demonstrate that shared history can be a foundation not just for reflection, but for meaningful and inclusive progress.